Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. May I ask everyone to turn any electrical devices to silent. Apologies have been received from Jackie Bailey and we welcome Rhoda Grant in her place. Dean Lockhart has indicated he's unavoidably running late and should join us shortly. The first item on the agenda is a decision on taking business in private. And that is to take items 3 and 4 in private. Is the committee agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We now turn to item 2 on the agenda, which is our energy inquiry. And today we have with us the witnesses who are going to spend some time with us. First of all, Chris Morris, who is the manager of Local Energy Scotland. Claire Mack, who is Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. Joanne Wade, who is the Deputy Director of the Association for Decentralised Energy, and last but not least, Guy Jefferson of the Energy Networks Association. So welcome to all four of you. There's no need to press any buttons or operate the sound system. That will be done by the sound desk. And if you want to come in and are not getting into the discussion at any point, just indicate by raising your hand and I'll try and bring you in, subject to time constraints, of course, because we do have limited time this morning. So if I might start, first of all, just a question about community and locally owned energy and what effects that has on local communities. Are there currently projects with local energy or community energy projects that the panel members are aware of and might give us some indication of how these work with their local communities? I see Claire Mack nodding her head.
Yes.
You want to?
Firstly, apologies just for holding up proceedings for a moment there. We were behind a school party coming through security, so my apologies for that. So there's a lot of really rich case studies, and I think that that's one of the things that help us explain a bit more about local and community energy systems and how they might operate here in Scotland, because they can be set up in different ways and can deliver very different benefits. So, for example, you've got the island of Egg, where their local energy system was set up as a blend of solar, wind and storage because they didn't have an energy network that predated that, and that just works as a sort of self-balancing islanded system which provides energy to the island of Egg. Then you've got other systems like Point and Sandwick, which is the UK's largest owned community wind farm, and it's on the Isle of Lewis, so developed and funded under very much a commercial basis and returns money to the community, so very much on a revenue basis. That one, and they choose how they distribute funds from that, so they do things like support the local hospice, but they've also done some domestic energy efficiency programmes as well with the money that has come through from there. Then you have something like Fintry, for example, again, community-led project, which is very much mission-led. In terms of fuel poverty, they sort of recognised that they wanted to use their local energy to try and alleviate very high levels of fuel poverty in their area. So there are different ways that you would bring these things to market and you would get slightly different results from them. So a local energy system much more like Egg, where you're looking to deliver energy, or all the way through to a community-led system like the one in Fintry, which does a slightly different thing.
And is there sufficient funding to help start up such projects?
That's one of the big challenges, is that the funding has been patchy, and obviously deployment is dependent very much on that funding. So we do think that there's probably a role for a clearer, more joined up funding landscape. You've got a good blend in there at the moment, so you've got things like CARES funding, and you've also got on the heat side, we've used a lot of funding from the LCITP fund, Scottish Government Administered Fund, which has a lot of EU funding within it. So again, there's a question mark over the future of that funding. And how you bring these smaller scale developments to market has been a continued issue because of the lack of clarity over UK government funding in there for things like the feed-in tariff and other small scale funding requirements that are in there. You've also got some private sector funding that's come in through people like SSE and through Scottish Power Energy Networks, so SSEN, I think I've already spoken to you, and SPEN too through their Green Economy Fund. So there's a blend of funding, but quite difficult, I imagine, as a community, if you were looking to bring forward one of these projects, to understand that landscape and be able to access it.
All right, thank you. I'm sure others will have comment on these and other areas as we move along. Jamie Halkard-Johnson has some questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. I was just wondering, I mean, there are in various parts of the network constraint issues, so I was just and the need to improve the grid. So I was just wondering what work's been done to kind of coordinate demand and generation assets so that some of those costs may be shared.
So in terms of networks, I work for Scottish Power Energy Networks here on behalf of the ENA. We try and work very closely with communities to look at the different options. We have publicly available heat maps, for example, to indicate where we have opportunities on the network. But yeah, you're right, the network is very saturated in terms of the ability to connect, and where possible we look to try and work with local communities around flexible connections, where it's non-firm, as we call it, but we can connect and allow community energy schemes and local energy schemes to transmit onto our network at certain parts of the day through a flexible arrangement. So those are the types of different options we have if we're not able to give them a firm connection, if the grid doesn't have the available capacity. We will eventually get there. It's just in some cases it requires a deep reinforcement, which if the community are not able to pay for that, which is sometimes a big stumbling block in terms of these schemes being economical, then there is a hold up, and we have to wait sometimes for others to come to help pay for that reinforcement. So I know that is a big issue with some of the schemes that are, I guess, shovel ready. But again, one of the things we're looking to do, and very positively on Monday you will have noticed that Ofgem have now put forward a 9-point action plan to deal with some of the decarbonisation issues, which I know this committee have heard evidence on EVs, for example. That's some of those challenges for EVs, and reinforcement for EVs is exactly the same for some of these community energy schemes. So delighted to see that Ofgem have now responded as of Monday, and they are now accepting that they have a statutory obligation towards net zero, which means that we can work very hard with them on our upcoming price review to look at some of these issues with regard to the high cost of connections.
Chris Morris.
Can I come in very quick? Can I just ask another quick question before you come in, Mr. Morris? There are obviously areas where there is saturation at the moment. Does that prevent local schemes being brought online? Is that consideration around constraint? Well, is there any consideration to that given in terms of planning permission? Should it be?
In some cases it does mean there is a constraint, but what we've been trying to do, and it is quite difficult, is look to get some flexible arrangements. So for example, there are some large schemes in Dumfries and Galloway, for example, and one down in Dunbar, where we didn't have the capacity to connect all the energy sources that were coming on stream. So we put together what we call an A&M scheme, which is a flexible scheme which allows people on a first-come, first-served basis, where there is capacity available any one time on a real-time basis, then people can generate, or communities can generate more effectively. It's not a firm connection, so they may be constrained, but what we find is, on a lot of occasions, especially where you've got different technologies like wind, which obviously, if there's no wind, there's no power, and there are other types of technologies that are connected in that area. Dunbar, they have the recycling scheme, the waste to energy scheme, which is pretty base load, 30 megawatts all the time. Different types of technologies, and you find you can connect flexibly. You don't need that firm connection. So there are ways of doing it, but it can be constraining with some schemes.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Morris.
That's fine. Chris Morris, I run the Scottish Government's Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, so kind of very much on the front face of supporting community groups developing projects. Just a kind of couple of points just to pick up on that. We have supported really good innovation projects that have looked to try and connect generation to consumption. We had one in Mull called the Access Project that switched storage heaters on and flow batteries on, heating elements on when the generator was generating a lot, and could switch it off to operate within a constrained system. So there are some great examples there. The challenge is taking those innovations and making them kind of business as normal and work economically time and time again to try and allow the deployment, because undoubtedly the grid does have a significant impact on connecting community energy projects and can make them unaffordable. What I'd say in terms of the kind of planning side of things and how we've engaged with the way we work is we actually have both DNOs sat on the funding panel, so at least it allows us to understand the scale of the issue and get that engagement with the DNO right at the beginning of projects, so they're kind of actively working with them, and we do see that good level of engagement and support from DNOs, but you know, there's restrictions in the wires which often stop projects connecting or make them much smaller or very expensive to connect.
Okay, just because I'm from Orkney, and there's a scheme up there which is hailed repeatedly, which does seem to provide some sort of solution to grid constraint issues. Should, and I know this is obviously providing to commercial to ferries, but should there be more consideration given in local plans for what we're talking about here? Should that be a consideration when local plans are put together? Should there be more consideration in local planning decisions?
Yes, Joanne Wade.
Absolutely. Things that we very strongly advocate is looking at zoning, not only for electricity but heat and energy efficiency, giving the local authority the opportunity to look at what's the best solution for their community, and then using that mechanism to enable the funding to flow in from national schemes, but having a really clear plan that says, for this type of building stock, for this type of community, this economy, these are the best energy solutions. And therefore we want to access the mechanisms, and that can be linked to planning, and it can be linked to the local heat and energy efficiency strategies and all that kind of thing.
But is that happening at the moment, or does it need to?
Not as much as it needs to. There's maybe some individual examples of good practice, but they're few and far between. I think it's something that really needs to be developed.
Okay.
I suppose I can talk to a couple of examples of good practice, if that helps. We've done some work around community-led local energy planning, because I think you're absolutely right, this idea of not just looking at the grid and trying to connect as much as possible, but actually thinking, well, what are the local needs in our area? What's going to be built? Is there a school coming along? Is there additional capacity? Is there a spare heat source here? So we did some work with a European funded project looking at developing local energy plans that are very community-led, with the community in mind, and we had one in Barra, for example, and Drumnadrochit are two kind of good examples of this. And I think there's a real strength for this in getting individual local people involved, but they only really work if you've got the local authority on board as well, and if you've got the DNO on board. So you are looking and setting out a longer term kind of ambition about what you want to see in terms of energy projects within the area.
Okay. Yes.
I'd agree wholeheartedly that more local planning is absolutely essential. I refer back to the announcement by Ofgem on Monday, which is encouraging. They are now starting to talk about decentralisation of some powers from London, which I think is absolutely essential. I think it's a mistake to believe that Ofgem can manage all the different requirements from London. The local communities are running at different paces. We notice that even in our area, which is Central Scotland for SP Energy Networks in Liverpool and Merseyside. Everybody's running at a different pace, and I think it's important to get local energy planning, but also some powers in terms of potentially reinforcing, investing in the things that the local communities want to do. But that's a long-term proposition. We will have a number of areas of our network which are already constrained, but are going to be constrained in the future. If we can share those long-term plans with the local communities, then we can plan a lot better for solutions, because there are some solutions that community energy groups can give to us to alleviate some network concerns that we have, and that's a potential revenue stream for community energy groups as well. So I would wholeheartedly agree that local planning is essential.
Okay. Just last question very quickly. Is a more localised energy, more localised delivery of energy, i.e. generate locally, use locally, more efficient in terms of both use of the energy and also cost-wise in terms of not having to have the same level of infrastructure across the whole of the country?
So from an electrical point of view, the answer to that would be yes, but again, we need to look at the current charging mechanisms. Now, Ofgem again are looking at charging and looking to reconstruct that given all the pressures of decarbonisation, etc. And I know in terms of some of the issues that community and local energy schemes have currently in terms of selling energy locally, and the ability to do that in an efficient way is held back by some of the regulatory barriers. But Ofgem again are looking at that, and again their announcement on Monday gives some confidence that that is being taken very seriously now.
Rhoda Grant.
Yeah. Just on, I suppose, the tensions within Ofgem and the job they have to do. When you're looking at grid reinforcement, quite often there are communities there who would develop renewable energy, but don't have the resources to tie up vast amounts of money in a development where they know there is no access to the grid. But in order to reinforce the grid, they have to be in some part of the planning system for Ofgem to count them. This is an issue I've had in the Western Isles, where we're facing having an interconnector installed that will not be adequate for what is required there. But the trouble is Ofgem can't measure what might be required because those systems are not in planning yet, and they won't go into planning until such time as there's access to the grid. So there's this tension as to which comes first. How do we solve that?
I absolutely recognise the issue that you're talking about, and it was one of the key disappointments, I guess, for us as a trade association around the last Contracts for Difference round, that it didn't deliver some of the projects that we were hoping would come through in order to make those investments in interconnection a reality in there. I mean, I think overall we've got to be really clear that the electrification of heat and transport will increase demand significantly, and as we get greater oversight of that, we should be able to plan for anticipatory investment, as it's so called, going there. And I think that's a really key part as well of this conversation about local energy systems too, which is, on the one hand, they can be really helpful at alleviating those grid constraints. But the more that you do that, how does that impact your investment case for something like an export link, like an interconnector? And I think that that is something that we do need to have a much deeper conversation about as we go forward, is around what the opportunities are for very particular areas of Scotland, because we know that the wind resource, for example, in particular, in the north and across the islands, is very, very good. And we also know that demand is going up universally. So I think there is more that we can do to try and work through those demand issues and what that means for future investment in terms of infrastructure.
Just briefly, I have a lot of, it's very, very challenging for projects on the Western Isles at the moment with this fantastic resource, a real appetite to do it. They've seen neighbouring communities do it and want to do it themselves, and the grid is a constraint to doing that. The solution's really tricky because you have to have a lot of resources in place for securities and to pay for grid deposits and be able to join the scheme. One solution might be to develop the project much further before going into the grid. In the past, we've almost done the grid as one of the first things. In project development, we might need to flip that round and develop the project much further. But there's a lot of risk around that in terms of will it get a grid connection down the line. So I think this is a real live issue. I don't think there's an easy solution to it, but I think one should be worked through because the communities with appetite who want to make positive contributions in their community who can't at the moment.
Right. Deputy Convener.
Oh, thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just stick with the community element for a wee minute. Please just get your views on how the either local energy systems or community-owned energy systems are different. We know that. How they spring up. I'm curious about communities that might stand to benefit greatest from these schemes. How do we ensure, or does anyone ensure, or try to ensure, that perhaps communities in greatest need can get access to these systems? Where's the expertise for them? Do they have enough capacity locally to deliver these? And perhaps what's the Scottish Government's view on how that should work? Claire?
Yeah, happy to go. Yeah, I think you've hit upon a really, really key issue, and it's one that has been an issue across other infrastructure projects. So broadband, for example, we're very clear that sort of community level broadband will develop in areas where you've got people with specialist expertise, for example, will give you a really, really big boon in there. One thing that is common to any project, whether it's local or community, is planning. and that's something that that we can work on. Is it's the same for both. The other projects will need perhaps different policy supports, because they do offer, as we've already discussed, different socioeconomic benefits, and you want to drive them potentially in a different way. Expertise is a really, really important part of this, and how we gather that expertise, and also understand the different solutions in rural, suburban and in urban areas as well for local energy systems. So I think there probably is a lot of variables that we need to try and bring together, and that kind of knowledge base is going to be really, really important, because they are very complex, and as Chris has already explained, there's potential for a lot of money to be involved in terms of guarantees in here as well. So I think looking at being able to use things like the LHEs to bring people together, to help them to understand, to drive more engagement in these, making these more sort of normalisation is pretty key. That ability for people to, as a community, to come together and understand what their assets look like. So if you have a big industrial player within your space, what are their heat requirements? What are the capability for them to help you with waste heat usage and things like that, in order to drive other parts of your community project? So there's lots of missing links in there just now, and I think there is a lot of potential for this to come together as an information source to help communities who do want to engage and do want to be part of a solution.
Joanne Wade and then Chris.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I'd echo what Claire said. I think it's the key role, I think, of local government and Scottish Government is, if the local government has the plan that says these are the best solutions that our community has come up with, you then get onto the Scottish Government, the Westminster Government role of, for that community, with its level of capacity and money, can it achieve what the best solution is for itself? And if it can't, that's where the help is needed. So whether that's developing skills in the local workforce to install the things that are part of the system, or whether it's providing financial support for low-income households to meet the level of energy efficiency they need, it's where the local plan can interact with national government policy and supporting framework that I think is where we can actually really tackle this problem.
Chris?
I suppose from my perspective, we've seen a lot of community energy projects in the past in the Highlands and Islands, often in very rural communities, and really through kind of opportunity around hydro and wind and need as well. I think with the development of kind of energy systems, where you're looking at the kind of generation and the use of energy, there's a lot more opportunities within communities across in more urban areas, in deprived communities as well. We have a role to help those communities develop projects, and we have development officers who help develop a project from that community having an idea of what they want to do, right the way through to completing their project or attracting funding into the project. And I think that's a really key role, because I think without that kind of hand-holding and expertise and support through the project, particularly for communities with low capacity who don't have funded development officers, don't have support, I think it's very, very challenging to take a project through. I also think there's a real prize here in getting energy systems within all communities, but particularly deprived communities. If we want to see the uptake of heat pumps we want to see, and of PV across our communities, and people doing this, having these active community buildings where you can go and see and touch and feel and understand these technologies and be part of it, I think can really help accelerate progress and involve more people in developing climate mitigating actions themselves in their homes.
Okay. Could I just ask you, how would it work in practice? Could I just ask you, like, a town like Kilmarnock, right, 50,000 population, some areas are pretty high up in the SIMD index and so on. So a community in there says, we would like a share of this experience and technology and so on and so forth. How does a community kind of form itself to come together to be one of these lucky recipients of this new technology? Because sometimes they're pretty big, you know, so the peripheral housing estates in many towns in Scotland can be pretty substantial. So who is it that helps to kind of shape the kind of reasonable size and makeup of a particular community that is best to deliver these projects? How do we go about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that one as well, because it's very much part of what the Community Renewable Energy Scheme does. And it's really working with those individual people or communities who want to take something forward. And one of the first things we'll do on a scheme is we can give them a small initial grant that can help them. We often find community energy schemes can be like 4 or 5 people's idea, and that isn't enough. You need to go out to the wider community, share your ideas, try and get buy-in and support, because to deliver a project you need more involvement. So we can help a community from those few individuals coming together to setting up a community group, to working through to see whether or not their project's feasible. If it's feasible, we can help attract finance into it. So it's hand-holding all the way throughout the project development to make a project happen.
Does it need folk though to come forward? Is there no kind of strategic oversight that says, these are really ideal areas here, and approaching the community? You've got to wait till people come forward and ask for it. I mean, is that the way around this works?
In the past, it has a little bit, and it's come a lot from, you know, the organisations with capacity like development trusts and things like that, who've taken the, you know, helped develop the project. I think you're right. I think there's a way of looking at, well, where are the kind of opportunities on the energy network, where are the opportunities in resource, and you know, where are those communities in the greatest need, and actively targeting them is something that could be positively brought into the scheme. And I think that helps on the kind of fairness agenda as well.
Claire?
Yeah, just to build a little on Chris's point there, I think decarbonisation to date of the electricity system has happened very much behind closed doors. People haven't been involved because it's happened at a systems level. You know, that is completely changing with heat and transport, and people are becoming much more aware not only of their use of energy, but, you know, where it actually comes from. You know, it's not a case of just flicking a light switch now, and I think that will drive a lot more people to question, you know, what is on their doorstep. And you're starting to see a trend as well. I think it was certainly in the committee's own material that I read in advance of this around what's happening in terms of the development of community and local schemes. They were coming through development trusts, but now industry has become a lot more important in that development phase, and that will continue to happen. That is not stopping. That need for industry to be able to decarbonise itself, you know, as part of that large sort of 50% of energy use that's heat and cooling. And they will have to start to look for local solutions, because presumably relocating is not going to be an ideal scenario for them. So working with their communities, I think industry will be a key partner here alongside the local authority in drawing up those kind of local plans. I take your point is that you need to do that at that level, but I think somebody also needs to look across the top and make sure that we're definitely going to meet our targets as we go. And I think that's a really, really important part of this too. But there's nowhere better, I think, than Scotland to, you know, in terms of the mind having been sharpened on all of that, because we have the earlier net zero date, because we've got things like COP coming to Scotland as well. It certainly has made the conversation accelerate.
And not leave communities behind.
Absolutely,
that may benefit greater than others, perhaps. So thank you very much for those points. Thank you.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just following up on the Deputy Convener's question of community and locally owned. I mean, what's the definition of locally owned?
So it's around the so, for example, a farm and estate where the owner of the scheme is based in Scotland is local ownership. So there's good examples like Mars Hill is a kind of farmer in North Lanarkshire who's developed projects on their own land, having seen lots of wind farms go up around them and wants to do it themselves, and has also worked with the local development trust to have a 25% ownership of it. So the development trust owns a quarter of the project alongside the farmer. But so in that example, the 75% would be locally owned and the 25% community share would be community.
Okay, so a landowner who lives in England or in an offshore tax haven wouldn't be eligible?
They shouldn't be eligible. The challenge is kind of often sort of demonstrating that and looking into the numbers and understanding that kind of track record. But that's, you know, it's trying to understand which schemes are kind of in and which are out.
Okay, and in your view, is there enough support available for communities and locally owned schemes to get off the ground?
I think there needs to be more support, because everything's changed a lot in terms of the subsidy support for community energy projects through the feed-in tariff. It's getting harder and harder to connect systems to the grid. Systems are becoming more complex because they involve people. So I think community energy is drawing a transition, and there's a great opportunity. And I think with more resources put into it, we could really kind of make more projects happen and try and build this real movement, which I think we need to kind of hit our wider climate target. So for me personally, I would say we need kind of more to represent the kind of transition, and we perhaps, in the past, we supported through things like loans. We perhaps need more capital investment into projects to kind of really kickstart them and give them a good opportunity to thrive.
And does the private sector have a role in providing some of that capital, perhaps?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know whether...
Yeah, I think it does. And I think one of the key things is it's not just about more support, but it's about more certainty of support. As we move from the simpler schemes that are set up by people who've got a lot of capability and are really enthusiastic, broadening it out to more diverse communities, communities that need longer to come together behind an idea. The sort of traditional way where we've had a pot of money that's been available for a year and then has gone away again won't enable those communities to take part, and also won't encourage the private sector to join in. So I think there needs to be a more strategic and longer term plan with some funding behind it, and that would enable a broader range of private sector involvement and a broader range of community involvement.
Yes, Guy.
Yeah, and speaking on behalf of the networks businesses in Scotland, we have a huge part to play in this. As we've discussed already, sometimes the costliest part is the connection to the network. So both ourselves in SP Energy Networks and SSE have funds available to assist with some of those projects. We have a green economy fund which is used for a variety of things, one of which is supporting community projects. What we're trying to do in our most recent price review is build in that community energy fund into our price review process and make that a more sustainable support to these projects. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's certainly going to support and allow some of the pilot projects we've been very successful with over the last couple of years to build on that. So we recognise our requirement there, but from our perspective as well, community energy and local energy will play a very important part in the future of supporting the network and security of the network. I draw the committee's attention to a report we are launching today. We've sponsored a report via WPI. I'll make that available to the committee as part of the evidence. That tries to bring together what the potential is for community energy. We believe there is huge potential, up to potentially 3 gigawatts across the UK, a large proportion of which we would expect to happen in Scotland if the dynamics are right. If the support is right for those projects from all the parties involved, we think it can play a huge part, not in obviously providing the amount of energy that we need for the future, but also supporting the network in rural locations in particular, where we need help from those types of communities to make sure that we have security of supply in those areas. And that again is a potential revenue stream for the future to make these schemes more viable from an economic point of view moving forward.
And is there a level playing field in terms of policy and support and tax and all the rest of it between community schemes and corporate schemes? I mean, obviously, community schemes are more difficult to get off the ground. You get a lot of people to agree and all the rest of it. Corporates can move fast, but setting that to one side, those are challenges that also face locally owned schemes. I mean, beyond that, does public policy treat them equally? Broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking, a little bit in terms of where we focus our resources, we put a lot more time and effort into communities because they need more support. There's a challenge for communities against the kind of corporate, for example, in that the community is tied to a place, it's tied to that locality, it needs to develop in that locality, where a commercial developer might develop 2 or 3 sites and go for whichever's the most economic or the kind of best agreement can be made with the landowner, for example. So I think communities have a constraint in terms of their place, but that's also their strength as well, that they are tied to a place, they are connected to that community to take things forward. There used to be some good incentives through, for example, if you did share offers, you could get tax relief and things like that helped cheap money get into community energy, and things like that have been removed, which I think were a real kind of a real stimulant for the sector. So I don't think there's many advantages that community energy kind of gets. I think it gets a lot of goodwill, and rightly so as well, because but I don't know whether or not it gets particularly enhanced support.
I mean, I've got 2 shares in community renewable projects. Are you saying I don't get the tax benefit anymore?
You do, because you invested at that time, but any new scheme. So if we started a new one, you wouldn't get the tax benefit that you got, which is an incentive, and the hope of things like that is it allows a lower interest to be paid to members of that scheme. So yeah, new schemes wouldn't get that.
I would still invest regardless of the tax
Exactly.
incentive, which is not significant.
Interestingly, we've had some schemes recently that have done it through gift aid, and it's amazing. You know, people really get behind the schemes and are happy to donate as well as invest in schemes.
And is there more scope for like crowdfunding and stuff, schemes? Because there's a lot of people in society who would like to support the move to zero carbon energy, and often they might have £100 or £200 they'd be happy to invest, but it's very, very difficult to be able to find where to put that money.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that. I think there's lots of different routes now, and I think crowdfunding is an interesting one because it is one where you can place your money with the developer effectively, so you don't then take on the responsibility that you might do in a community project. 'Cause I think when you talk about level playing fields, that's one of the key areas that I can see where perhaps there isn't quite the same balance of experience and expertise available to a community, and crowdfunding helps to move around that in some way. And we can see, certainly in a Scottish context, there's been some popularity of those schemes, particularly in the wave and tidal sector, tidal in particular. We've certainly seen 2 open crowdfunding rounds for that. So I think there's lots of different ways, different balances of risk and different balances of return, depending on different models that you take. So to take us back to the beginning, you can, as an individual investor, crowdfunding works because it allows you to be a stakeholder in something that you believe in and something that you know it sort of aligns with your values, and all the way down to these other schemes like Fintry, for example, who are trying to draw money together to help their local community. And I think that does ultimately come back down to that, which is where is that funding that has in the past been the carrot that has driven a lot of local and community projects to come to the fore, and crowdfunding would offer a slightly different outcome. So I think it's always good to have a balance of different ways for people to engage with projects differently, but I do think we need to be very aware that you will get very different outcomes depending on what your input and engagement is in the first instance.
Okay, I just want to move on to some questions around kind of smart energy, because in your evidence, the Association of Decentralised Energy talked about smart decentralised energy systems being absolutely critical. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this, and I know people have, for example, smart meters. I know they're not smart in the same sense we're talking about here, but, you know, a lot of people I speak to just don't use them, or they don't work, or whatever. I mean, presumably we have the technology to do this. We have the technology. What's the kind of timescales for realistically rolling this out, so that not only decentralised energy systems can be more effective, but also individual households can use energy smarter? I mean, give us some sense of the realism on this.
So I think the next decade is the crucial time. We need better data, and we've got the smart meters, and you get an awful lot from that. But it needs to be made accessible to people. It needs to be made. People need to be able to share it with who they want to share it with. I mean, I've got a smart meter, but I can't take that data and give it to somebody who can tell me how to better use my home. It goes to my energy supplier and stays there. So I need access to it. I need to be able to either understand it if that's what I want to do, or give it to someone else who'll tell me what to do. And I can't do that at the moment. But there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to do that over a relatively short time period. But then I think we need also to help the sector build trust with people and get the rules right over that sharing of that data. So I need to be confident if I'm sharing my information with somebody that it's on the right basis, that it's for the good. I need to have it explained to me that a smart system is actually a cheaper system and a fairer system. Because at the moment, I kind of feel I've been given a smart meter because the system needs it. I don't, as a consumer, I do not understand that it's going to be good for me. That education of consumers hasn't happened. It can happen relatively quickly. I don't see why we can't have a much smarter and therefore more efficient and therefore more affordable system within the next decade.
Right, thank you. We'll move on to questions now from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to talk a little bit about storage and battery technology. We've had evidence that Scottish Power Energy Network is highlighting the need for anticipatory investment and more integrated planning across transport, heat and network sectors. We're talking about grid constraints here. What role can storage and battery technology play in the viability of community and local energy projects? I mean, does it receive any form of support from any of the schemes that are out there?
So I think it's got a huge part to play in terms of where we have constraints, particularly in the network, and rather than turning off a wind farm, for example, then if we can charge a battery and use that energy, not waste that energy, then at some future point we might need that energy to support the network potentially, and there can be revenues that are realised from that. Again, this is Chris and I were talking about this prior to the session today. One of the challenges that the networks need to provide is a much longer term view of where we will need that type of support that batteries might provide, because we do have flexibility auctions currently now ongoing which ask for support from, for example, from a battery scheme where we have restrictions in our network. But obviously, unless you've got the battery there now, you can't actually participate in that auction. But if we have a longer term view of when we might require that support in the network, then investing in a battery becomes a better commercial proposition.
Do we know how much work's been done on this, or is it all just theory?
In terms of?
In terms of battery storage?
I don't think it's theory. I think there are some commercial providers out there in terms of batteries, but they're looking for a market at the moment. There isn't really a market for some of the larger battery services. So they're pilot projects. They're there to understand the dynamics of these projects, but from a commercial proposition, they're not really in that position as yet.
Is there much support for this? You know, financially or anything else?
Yeah, in terms of the support, there's well, actually, just to take a step back, at the moment, you kind of intuitively know we need lots of storage on the network. You know, we've got lots of wind, lots of solar. We're going to need storage to kind of manage those gaps. But it's very difficult to make the commercial argument at the moment. It's almost like the market's still to catch up to make it to a point at which you could borrow money, for example, and say, I'm going to put a battery in. A lot of the battery projects that kind of work financially at the moment are behind the meter. So it's where you've got a big user of energy and they're generating, say, solar panels on the roof they've got, and they've got battery storage, and they can smooth their demand. And that kind of works economically because you're offsetting buying that energy and not having to consume that. But in a way, probably to benefit the network and the grid and everybody, you'd be better doing that at a community scale rather than putting little individual batteries in people's homes or businesses. Try and do that at a bigger aggregated community scale. But commercially, there's not a strong argument to build that out and know you'll get revenue from that at the moment. The support we've provided through CARES is very much about trying to get batteries into community buildings, housing association properties at that kind of scale to address kind of fuel poverty or make community assets work better, not at a kind of bigger strategic level in terms of deploying batteries.
I mean, simplistically, it seems to me that there's a lot of energy lost in the network, one way or another, not the least from wind farms. So it seems obvious to me that large-scale storage of energy, whether it's through batteries or by some other scheme that's going to come, it seems to make sense. How much research is going into this? How much work is going into this?
I think... Like first, I think you make an absolutely excellent point, because one of the key issues certainly at Scottish Renewables that we continue to deal with is around the constraints within the system and how that's managed. And at the moment we use a constraint payment system which works. It's the best way we've got to manage that that system just now. But it would be ideal in the future to do exactly what you're talking about, is not to waste any energy and be able to use it. I think there's a huge opportunity in electric vehicles here, because they provide a certain amount of depth into that system as well, which is that you can use them as mobile batteries in the same way that in Orkney the ferry is actually used as a mobile battery. And being able, there's a lot of change to happen in that particular area just now, so that's probably why you haven't seen a good body of evidence as yet, because it is an incredibly dynamic space just now. But being able to understand more about each locality's energy demand would certainly be a great first step to figuring out what their potential supply is, what their potential oversupply is, and therefore what the potential for storage would be. Because one of the key sort of benefits of storage too is adding resilience into the system, and that's a really big thing when you have these smaller localised energy systems, is that you do need that level of resilience as well, which at the moment that resilience is provided by being part of the grid, and we kind of know that we've got really strong capabilities within there to send power when we need it, to stop power when we don't need it, and to be able to make sure that we can maintain that balance, because it is an incredibly fine balance at a national level, and would be the same at a localised level as well, because you are reliant upon intermittent sources, a blend of them albeit, which is great. When you put them all together you start to build that resilience, and storage is just another tool to add into that. But I think that's probably why you're not seeing exactly the kind of plan that I think you're absolutely correct that we do need, is how do we manage our resources better, and how does storage play a key role in that, in order for us to use all of these resources and not see them simply just pass by. Yeah.
Could I just add that when we think about storage as well, we shouldn't just think about batteries. I mean, we already think about batteries in cars as well as fixed batteries, but you know, we need to think about the crossover between the electricity system and heat, and we need to think about effectively making our building stock more of an energy store, because if a building is efficient, you can flex when you're demanding the heating much more. So particularly as we electrify heat, you know, you need to get to a point where you can say, I'm not going to use the heat pump for the next couple of hours because we've got a constraint on the system. And that's fine, because my building is so efficient that it's not going to cool down. So we need to think about storage in a really kind of broad way if we're going to get to the optimal system.
What you're describing is fine for more modern buildings that have the heat retention and so on, but older buildings, which are by far the majority of Scottish stock, have their own challenges, which might not be met by what you described.
Absolutely, but I do think that they're going to have to be upgraded to be fit for the future, because it's not only about being useful to the energy system, it's about delivering comfort and health for the people who live in them. And without those upgrades, they never will do that, no matter how smart the system is and how low carbon their energy supply is. If the building doesn't work, it will still be cold and damp and uncomfortable. So we have to upgrade them, and when we do upgrade them, and I'm not saying that's not a trivial thing, that's a difficult thing, but it needs to be done for all sorts of reasons. And then when we do that, they have the opportunity to become a useful asset for the system as well.
Looking at the grid constraints, which are obviously a real problem, what work is actually being done to bring electricity and gas DNOs together to consider these problems on grid constraints?
So we do, and we are obligated by our licence, but we work with, for example, here in Scotland, Scotia Gas Networks, to look at how our technologies might work together. So there are some pilot schemes currently underway across Scotland. There's one up at Leavenmouth, for example, that is there to demonstrate how we might work together to deliver against some of these constraints. But they are very early in conception, and they are pilot schemes at the moment, so there's significant work to be done to understand how we might be able to support each other. In terms of grid constraints overall, again, as part of our new price review period, which is now starting to negotiate our new price review for 2023, that is some years away, but we are now starting to work with Ofgem to look at how we might alleviate these constraints a little quicker by democratising some of the charges across the asset base, so that connectors, especially community and local energy schemes in particular, do not have to have this huge barrier in terms of the cost to connect. They still will have to pay for their connection assets, but the kind of shallow reinforcement can be paid for by the general consumer. And that's the way I think it'll end up going, although there is a lot of negotiation before we can get to that point. but hopefully that will deal with the issue. It seems like quite a long way away, but in reality it's in the short term, in the next 2 to 3 years, when we negotiate that deal.
The committee's... We'll move to Richard Lyle now for further questions.
Yes, before I come on to the question that I'm going to ask, I'd like to know when a major developer wants to build a housing development, or it could be a council housing development, part of the cost is the connection to the grid. Has there ever been any private or public housing developments that have their own energy supply, basically a wind turbine behind it or whatever? Is there any in Scotland?
I can't be absolutely definitive, but it's very rare for a new scheme to be in that.
Should we encourage that sort of development? Where we talk about things in Denmark and Sweden and whatnot, but we don't seem to encourage in Scotland, say, a development maybe a few miles away from the main supply, that we could have its own individual power supply, which would be less cost to the developer, less cost to the people who live there, and actually could give them benefit of, a community power supply.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, there is one example I can think of as you were talking there, down in Berwickshire. The Housing Association down there put together their own community scheme wind farm, and while building actual council houses, and they continue to generate significant revenues, and they're extending the scheme all the time. So that's a great example of the potential of such a thing.
I think Claire Mack and Chris Morris also want to go in.
Yeah, and just to respond, that sort of planning, absolutely highly desirable, and one of the things that will drive it is the Scottish Government targets around new build properties in 2024 being the date by which you look at electrified or low carbon heating systems for all of those. I think there are definitely local authorities who are thinking in that way. So I think one of the ones I'm aware of is Perth and Kinross. They're looking at large housing developments in their area and are looking holistically across heat and transport requirements in there. But I do think the key driver for this will actually be the heat networks target, and through the heat networks bill, and the heating target at 2024 for new build properties.
Just you asked for examples. Only a community-based one, but we're working with a community-based housing developer who's doing work at the moment, because there's quite a high grid connection cost to a new housing development. So they're looking at, well, what else could we do? Are there other options there? So that feasibility study is happening at the moment, and will hopefully help build the business case for those houses to be built, and also create a very kind of localised, sustainable system. So that's a example.
That leads me nicely on to my question. Can local authorities set up as a energy provider? There are often comments, and I was a councillor, many comments at council say they're not getting enough money. So could a council perhaps set up as their own energy provider to either provide power to their own offices, or to feed into the local network? Is that possible?
Yeah, you could, it's the ESCO model, so the energy services model. They can do that, and we're certainly seeing some of that in terms of heat networks development. And it is, I mean, because heat networks in particular they're big projects. They're very long-term projects which tend to be owned and operated by a supplier. And one of the great things about being a local authority is the key relationship that already exists between their citizens and consumers, if you will, and them. And there is a level of trust in there, which I think is really important when you're undertaking huge transitions like this. It comes back down again to whether there are skills and expertise, because it is quite an undertaking for any local authority, and they would need to be clear about how they would resource that and how they would want to use it. But you're correct that there is that opportunity there. Is there
government grants available for a, say, like, we're talking about an energy company? Is there, do we intend that we have local councils setting up their own energy company? Is there government grants for a council to do that?
I'm not aware of government grants to do that at the moment. I know that some local authorities have looked at it, but I think your question around can local authorities have a role, I think they've got so many different roles in this space potentially. And I wonder whether there's an exercise to be done to look at some of the good examples across the UK and in Scotland as well, to sort of say, okay, well, what's working, what are local authorities doing, what might be replicated, what can we learn? There's examples of Warrington who are looking at investing in energy schemes and buying energy schemes as a future revenue source, but also to kind of try and green their overall energy consumption. So there's some really good examples across the country about projects are doing that. There's Nottingham who set up an energy company. Yeah. I think there's probably an exercise to be done to kind of almost take stock and pull some of these examples together. So working with COSLA perhaps.
So basically, what would you suggest the roles and duties of local authorities are required to fulfil in relation to local energy systems and projects, and what do you think they're likely going to be asked to do in the future? What would we ask local authorities to do in the future? Develop that type of system that you're thinking of?
I think local authorities, one of the key roles they can play is through the kind of local heat and energy efficiency strategy and expanding that to give some certainty about here's the strategic priorities within this area, here's the type of projects we think we should develop, this is kind of where we see the energy system evolving, and these are areas where we should be putting heat pumps in, and to set that strategic direction. I think there is potentially a way for them to be involved in and maybe try and get some projects that generate revenue as well. They can also open up their roofs to community projects, you know, schools, public buildings can all be kind of really great community projects and get people coerced around them and the school community to take forward projects. So I think local authorities have a great role to play, but you know, I don't need to tell you, I think the challenge is going to be about resources of local authorities and just the headspace to be able to kind of support projects.
If you're going
like
to generate your own income, you know, you don't need to ask the government for money. But I'll ask a question. Aside from further financial support, what more can local authorities need to fulfil their role and enhance their activities in relation to local energy systems and projects?
Sorry, Claire.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think local planning is one of the key areas where they can facilitate projects and they can help them. And I think, as Chris had already alluded to, they can become the trusted partner as well and help engage and enthuse the community around it too, and be able to help build that just that community of interest around energy projects as well. I do think local authorities are absolutely crucial here, and we have seen some really excellent examples, and I think we need to be really clear that in Scotland the local authorities have actually really powered ahead with this stuff. We run the Scottish Green Energy Awards, which is about recognising the achievements of the energy industry and of its partners. And we, in the last year, saw a number of projects come forward through Fife Council, through Aberdeen Council in this space. They are becoming much more active in this space. And I think it is, exactly as Chris said, about making sure we spotlight that and demystify it and make it something that every local authority can see the benefit of being involved in an energy project, and to see what the potential, if it's revenue, then great, or if it's socioeconomic benefit as well, to allow them to be clear about what their outcomes they would want from any engagement in an energy project too.
Briefly, and then we'll come to further questions from Gordon MacDonald. Guy Jefferson.
Really, just to add to that, I think through that local planning and local councils being clear what they want to do, and I agree, there are a number in Scotland who have been very good at that. That allows us, from a networks point of view, to know exactly where we need to reinforce the network, and the opportunity through Ofgem's declaration on Monday and our new price review controls is that we can then start to make those decision-making processes much more local when it comes to reinforcement. And if the local planning is good, then I think we can be a lot more effective at connecting and supporting energy decarbonisation projects a lot quicker than we currently are. So I think the planning aspect is absolutely vital.
All right, thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. We touched upon earlier the importance of consumers in this creating of the smart local energy system, and you know the way that they engage is through their smart meter. So are you able to say how the rollout of smart meters is going, both across the UK and in Scotland? Because The original UK government announcement was in 2016 and it was due to end by 2020. And I know it's been extended for a further 3 years, but where are we with the rollout of smart meters?
I think, shall I start on that one? I think there are two things to say about it. One is that there are plenty of people who don't have one yet, but then there are also plenty of people who've got one and don't really know they've got one. And I think there's been a massive opportunity missed to use these devices properly to engage people with the energy system. Just having a smart meter doesn't mean somebody's engaged. They'll engage if they want to, but only if it's been explained to them properly and only if they feel like it. And I think there is a massive job we have to do to excite people about this and give them an opportunity to find it something that is of benefit to them and explain to them why a smarter system is better for them. And we've not done that. We've just helped a few people realise that the kettle uses a lot of power and focus all their efforts on that rather than realising that they should heat their home better. You know, I think it's gone quite wrong in a lot of ways, but they're there and we could use them better.
Okay, clear.
Yeah, again, just to build on that, I think Joanna's hit upon a really, really excellent point, which is that the smart meter is part of a package, and I think it comes back again to understanding more about your energy use is great, but also understanding how to reduce your energy use is even better, because the best kilowatt hour is the unused kilowatt hour. And that is the absolute basic principle from where everything should really start. And understanding the constraints around the building that you live in. So energy efficiency first, that should always be the mantra. And I think that's where I totally agree with Joanna, is that those things were never put together in that rollout. So I think that there's still scope to do more with that, because people haven't actually come too far on that journey to be able to start all over again and be able to help them get to the place that we need them to. Because we need to accelerate. That's the bottom line, is in order to hit all of the net zero targets that are around, and the more challenging one that sits here in Scotland is that acceleration. And as we've already discussed, the kind of heat and transport piece, we need to bring people with us. They need to understand what the benefits are, because apparently they need to know that.
So before I ask you to answer who's responsible for that public engagement and why hasn't it happened, with the figures I've got from the autumn 2019 there, 53 million metres have to be replaced in the UK, and only 17 million have taken place so far since 2016, which is less than a third. Would that be the right ballpark figure, and does that reflect what the situation is in Scotland?
I think that is around about the right figure, and it's the same in Scotland as it is in the rest of the UK. I'm sure the committee members won't be surprised when I say that there probably should have been a networks task to actually roll out smart meters. That's the way it's been done in the rest of Europe and anywhere where this has worked. We, in SP Energy Networks, we have colleagues in Spain who have rolled out 10 million customers smart meters in about 4 or 5 years, and they've got a 99% success rate. But that was a decision that was made some time ago, unfortunately. But I think the only way to move this on, in my belief, is that people need to understand the benefit of having a smart meter, and I don't think that's really been communicated very well. It's starting to happen with some retailers. They are saying that you can get benefits, but only if you have a smart meter. Yeah. So a simple one is an electric vehicle. So you can get a better tariff if you have a smart meter, and you can charge through the night, etc. And the price signals are not huge for that yet, but that's the sort of thing that we need to start to do, so people actually come and ask for them, because at the moment they're avoiding getting them installed rather than coming and ask for them.
I've got another question about smart meters, but before we come to that, who's responsible for that public engagement and why hasn't it happened?
I think it's a government responsibility, a UK government responsibility. And I know there is I can't remember the name of the association that are responsible for communicating this, but it is a central government responsibility in my view. We've all got a part to play in that, and again I think the retailers, as the ones tasked with actually rolling out the meter replacement, need to start engaging and convincing people that smart meters are actually going to save them money and be of use to them in the future.
Another question about smart meters. Most of the smart meters that have been installed are first generation smart meters. And according to the Consumer Association, or which, first generation smart meters aren't fully compatible with the network, and 70% lose smart function when they change supplier. So how do we rectify that when the vast majority, 1 in 7 are second generation smart meters, the vast majority, 15 million, are this first generation? How do we resolve that problem when we're still doing the rollout?
That's a good question. So I'm not an expert in some of the functionality of the SMETS 1 meters, as they call them, but I believe they can be programmed to get round some of these issues through the DCC, they call it, the central management. It's a large task, but I don't believe it's beyond us from a technical perspective.
And I think some of the more innovative energy suppliers are tackling the problem. I mean, I'm no expert on this either, but I have a SMETS 1 meter, and I'm just swapping energy suppliers, and my new supplier assures me that my meter will return to being smart within 6 weeks of the swap, because they're going to do something to it. I mean, I'm talking as a consumer here now, but there are solutions, and if the energy suppliers choose to apply them, they seem to be able to do it.
Yeah, I've got first generation, and I'll tell you, it took substantially more than 6 weeks before it started telling me anything.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
So what's the role does Ofgem have in all of this? If we're going to sell the benefits of smart meters, being able to, I can understand the network supplier. You know, they always used to get half-hour readings from large commercial users for years. Now we're going to get half-hour readings from domestic premises, and it'll be easier for them to match supply and demand. So I understand that benefit. But what's the role of Ofgem in selling it to the public? Do they have a role, or are they acting as a brake on the system? And where are we with that?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. That sort of consumer information campaign is very necessary. You know, we're aware lots of people are looking for information right now for various different reasons, not because of anything that Ofgem have or haven't done. It's been more to do with the so-called Greta effect, isn't it? That people are now starting to think about their own individual use. And I don't have a smart meter. Again, talking as a consumer, I have a sort of a different system. I've got a Hive system, but I'm already on that journey where I'm starting to learn more about my own use and how I change that. I think Ofgem have a very strong commitment to consumers from that costs perspective, so I think that puts them very heavily in the frame in this whole conversation. I do agree, but I think as well, I agree with Guy that this is not just going to sit in one source of information. Consumers should always be able to have a variety of sources to be able to go to, not so that it's confusing, but so that they can get the right information for them. And I think that, you know, one of the biggest kind of relationships that you have is with your energy supplier as well. So and good to hear that they see themselves in that space as well. And then also people like Chris and other people like the Energy Savings Trust too are also being great at bringing together advice. I do think that there is a need for bringing together somewhere for people to go to get a source of information about what's right for them, their particular building type. If you do or don't have an EV, if you've got the potential to put solar panels on, is that the right thing for you to do? Particularly when the funding sources are declining at such a rate. You know, it does then become an investment decision rather than something that might actually offset it'll offset your bills. It'll always do that, but it won't necessarily give you the additional revenue that you might have looked for in the past through a feed-in tariff. So you have to be very clear about all the different variables that are in there. How long you might stay in your house, for example, as well, is a really, really key variable as to whether you would make the financial commitment into something like solar panels.
Okay, Chris.
There's not many strong tariffs at the moment to really encourage people to do this. And we've talked a lot about grid constraints and the issues around grid constraints, and yet we've got electric heating with some of householders in the highest rates of fuel poverty, with expensive sources of heating, which could provide services. So I think as the tariffs develop and as the technology develops, and you can genuinely reward people who've got storage heaters, for example, or heat pumps, you can really see that taking off. But who then gives the advice? I think there is a role, Scottish Government Fund, Home Energy Scotland, to give consumers advice. And I think the advice around this is going to be quite complicated. It's going to be really important to get people on the right tariffs and people looking at the market and understanding the market as that complexity increases. So yeah, that I think as the market develops and opportunities are available, there's really something to hang your coat on and say this is really worth doing. At the moment, the benefit's quite marginal in terms of the kind of flexibility tariffs. I think that'll come. We're starting to see the products come through.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panel for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session now. If there's anything further you wish to write in about to add to your evidence today, then please feel free to do that. Thank you.